Hello again, and welcome to our next module. And in this module, we're going to be beginning our look at some specific issues related to food and the ethics of food in 21st century America, and specifically starting off by looking at the impact of agriculture on the environment. Now, obviously, that is a huge topic, so we'll talk about some of the major issues that are brought up in connection with agriculture and different types of pollution. But we're really going to focus on looking at water pollution and the effects of kind of commercial or industrial agriculture on water, and a specific debate that's taken place about that in recent years. But before we get into that subject of water pollution and agriculture, I wanted to begin the module, and it's been the first half of the module, introducing our final textbook in the class, Food and Faith by Norman Wirzba, which, of course, is the only textbook we haven't gotten to yet, and this is going to be the one that we are going to be referring to off and on for the remainder of the course. So I thought I would start us off with assigning the first chapter from that book for this week. And before you embark on reading that, I thought it would be helpful to introduce the author in the book a little bit and give you a little sense of what it is he's doing. If you haven't read much theology before, or much in terms of Christian spirituality or things like that, it might be a little confusing as to what's going on here in the book. So I thought it would be helpful to give you a little introduction to that. So, to start off, obviously the book is called Food and Faith. It focuses on the relationship between Christian faith and our approaches to food. And like this course, Wirzba looks at all different aspects of the modern American food system, how it's produced, how it's processed, distributed, and also how it's consumed. And I think it would be safe to say that in all of those different areas, he's a critic of a lot of things that are currently going on within the food system, and argues for some pretty significant changes in the way we produce and consume food here in the U.S. Now, the reason I include this book is I think he does a very nice job of incorporating a lot of different material into his analysis. You can tell from reading the book and from his footnotes that he's read a lot of different philosophers and theologians. He refers to scripture, a lot of biblical passages. So he brings a lot of different views into consideration. And also I think it's a complement to the sort of formal, ethical, natural law approach that we've developed so far and that we will continue to use as we go through the class. With Wirzba's book, we get a little more of a focus on the other aspects of Christian belief, in particular beliefs about the nature of God, beliefs about how Jesus' death has significance for Christians and for the world, and just in general a more spiritual approach to the topics, and a little less of an ethical approach. And hopefully, if that doesn't seem very clear at the moment, you'll see that difference emerge as you are reading through this first chapter of the book. Another reason I thought it might be nice to include him is that we've really been having a very Catholic approach up until this point. Sachs's book is obviously from a Catholic perspective. Natural law is primarily, though not exclusively, a Catholic ethical system. And Wirzba is a Protestant and teaches at a Protestant school, Duke Divinity. And so I think it's nice to include him both to get a slightly different perspective from a Protestant viewpoint, but also to show, I think what you'll see as you read the book is that there's a great deal of overlap between what Wirzba argues for, primarily from a kind of biblical tradition and foundation, and what the Catholic natural law, Catholic social teaching positions argue for from their traditions. And so I think it shows how the biblical tradition and the natural law tradition actually fit together very nicely and agree on most things. The same is true, I think, of a Catholic look at food, and also a Protestant Christian view of food. So that's some of the reasons why I've included him. Some of the things that you'll no doubt notice as you read through his book. And there are a number of key themes that really kind of run through the book. And I'm not going to assign all of the chapters of the book to you, because honestly, I think in some places it's a bit repetitive. But I think part of the reason in doing it that way is he really kind of picks some key themes and comes at them from different perspectives, looking at different issues. And he lays out those key themes here in this opening chapter. One of his primary kind of ideas behind his work as a whole is this idea of creation, right? We've talked about looking at the world as creation as opposed to the product of a random chance event. We've talked about that before, and how that gives another level of meaning to the created world. But one of the things that Wirzba really emphasizes is that creation isn't sort of a one-time thing. It's not as if God created the world, started it up, and then steps back and just lets it run its course. If you know anything about the history of religion or have studied American religious history, you'll know that a lot of the founding fathers were what are commonly referred to as deists, right? Who had this sort of a view of God in the world, right? That God wasn't really involved in the world, that he set it all up and now it just runs kind of purely on its own rules, its own logic. And God's really not involved in the world on an ongoing basis. And you'll see from the very beginning that Wirzba has a very different approach. For him, talking about the created world as creation means that God is actively sustaining and working in the world. That God is not only present and really working in the world, but that is how God connects to people, right? And so, whereas some Christians tend to think of the relationship between a human being and God as something that happens kind of purely in the spiritual realm, right? It doesn't involve physical stuff. It doesn't involve matter or plants or animals or anything like that. Wirzba takes a very different approach. And he sees God connecting with us primarily through this material world and all these material things like plants and animals, even soil and water, and those sorts of things. And again, I think that is really kind of the foundational idea behind the whole book, that God works through the physical world, right? And of course, then if that's God working out there in the physical world, that means we need to respect and value the physical world in a really significant way, right? Because it's God working through the physical world around us. He relates to us through other creatures. This is a key theme that comes up over and over again. Wirzba doesn't argue that dolphins are our equals or that chickens are our equals or anything like that. However, he does argue that as creatures, we owe them respect, and we need to value their status both as creatures, and also we need to value the relationship they have with us. And one of the other aspects of that relationship that he really develops in the book is our dependence on other creatures, right? So as human beings, we depend on the created world, we depend on the other creatures in order to keep ourselves alive. And that's something that he emphasizes a great deal. And then finally, he really focuses on this idea of sacrificial love, right? So that when God is in this world acting through all the different parts of the world, that what is it that God does? Well, God loves, and God loves sacrificially, right? So that God is always giving of himself to others. And so that's what's going on in the created world around us, are all these different relationships that should be defined by the sacrificial giving of one to the other. And then, of course, if we as human beings, and especially as Christians, are supposed to be like God, that's going to mean that we should try to mimic that as much as possible. So those are going to be some of the key themes, and you can see that that's a little different approach than sort of the natural law, Catholic social teaching, ethical approach of more formal analysis. This is more thinking about, what are the big spiritual themes of Christianity, and how do those shape our view of the physical world, and more specifically shape our view of food and the way we relate to the creatures that we ultimately eat. What I wanted to do on this page was to give a little more specific introduction to the chapter that we're going to be reading for this module, Thinking Theologically About Food. Now, this is really an introductory chapter for the book, and so a lot of the themes developed in the book are going to be basically those that I just talked about as being the themes of the book just a couple of moments ago, so I will try not to repeat myself and waste your time there. And I did think it would be helpful, especially for those of you who don't maybe have a background in theology or in Catholicism, to explain some of these ideas before you get into the reading, so that you can better understand what's going on here and critically reflect on it, and then post about it on Blackboard. And so really I think there are two main parts to the chapter. In the first part of the chapter, he really focuses on this idea of community and really what I'm calling here the circle of life. I was really tempted when I wrote that down to put up a picture of the Lion King here on the page, but I decided that wasn't very academic or serious, so I went with this nice still life showing all these different animals that some hunter has lined up on this table. Which brings up, of course, this point that is a real focus of the first part of the chapter, that as human beings, we are dependent on other creatures, and even more specifically and more disturbingly, if you reflect on it, perhaps, we really depend on the death of other creatures in order to keep ourselves alive. But that's to step a little ahead of ourselves for a moment. Right, this first theme is the idea of community. And again, we've talked about this before, but this is, as I said, a real emphasis for Wirzba. We as modern people often tend to think of ourselves as individuals, right? Especially in America, we have this tradition of rugged individualism, right? That I do it all on my own, I don't need other people, I've earned my way to the top, so on and so forth. This has shown up in recent presidential candidates who will talk about, look, the only reason you're poor is because you haven't worked hard enough. Everything in life just depends on yourself and your own level of effort, which I think most people would recognize is really not a realistic view of the human condition. And in fact, we are all very much dependent on others, and we really need other people to relate to in order to be true persons. If somebody, really were to live on a desert island, in some ways you can't really be a full person by yourself. Some of you might remember the Tom Hanks movie from a few years ago called Castaway, where he was, stuck on this desert island out in the middle of the ocean for a long period of time. And you can see in the movie, right, the effect this has on him. And he just can't bear being by himself out there. So he actually, takes a volleyball and puts a little face on it and turns it into a companion, which is obviously not another person, but I think it's a nice indication of this idea that human beings need others to be in communion with, in community with, in order to really be fully functioning persons. Right? So one of the things that Wirzba talks about quite a bit in this chapter is this fact. It's a biological fact, right, that we depend on an ecosystem and other organisms to keep us alive, right? We eat some of them. We depend on others to transform carbon dioxide into oxygen, to do all kinds of other things. But we also need others in terms of emotional and spiritual connections as well. We can't really develop as persons without other people to relate to. And so that's going to be something that he spends a lot of time talking about in the chapter. And of course, as I just mentioned, right, another aspect to this that we may not think about so much is that our life depends on the death of other organisms basically every day. And again, this is something as modern Americans we don't really recognize or reflect on, right? That for most people, how do they encounter their food? Will they encounter their food in a package at the store, or in a restaurant or some other place like that, and the food comes wrapped in styrofoam and cellophane or in a can or what have you. And the closest we get to living food, if you will, is maybe the produce section of the supermarket, but that is still very much removed from the fields where all of these plants originally were growing, living plants. Now, of course, in previous generations and previous centuries, people had a very different encounter with their food. Right? You didn't get hamburger in a wrapper at McDonald's or in a nice cellophane package in the supermarket. You got hamburger from the cow out back. Or at the greatest remove, you probably went down to the butcher shop where there would have been actual animals being butchered, right, where you would be well aware of it. So we wouldn't have this disconnect from the fact that our eating and living depends on the death of countless plants and animals pretty much every day. And of course, some people are vegetarian and would argue that their eating does not depend on the death, at least of any animals, although that's certainly debatable, right, that the cultivation of the fields to produce the vegetables almost always is going to involve the loss of habitat for animals, and is almost always going to involve the loss of animal life as well. It's very difficult to plow a field or to disc a field without a good number of mice and so on perishing in the process. And I'm not trying to dismiss the concerns of vegetarians. I'm just trying to emphasize this point that Wirzba makes, that all of us depend on the death of other organisms, plants, and even probably animals, in order to remain alive. And where does he go with this? Well, you can see as he developed this in this chapter, he's not arguing that the lives of these animals or plants are equal to human lives. But he does say that when we become aware of this, that we do owe a certain gratitude. We should feel a certain humility in response to this. And as a result, we ought to turn around and do our best to sacrificially care for others. Right? And again, this is obviously meaning that we should die so some other creature can eat us. Instead, it means more of what are ways that we can support and nurture the lives of other people, or even support and nurture the lives of other creatures that make up the natural world. And so, in some ways, you can see this all, again, as kind of a refrain on the Lion King, right? We're all part of this circle of life, which can be a little hokey, I'll admit. But there is also some truth to that. And we think about it kind of seriously, and reflect on the contingency of life and how our lives are really kind of fragile things and we depend on the deaths of all these other organisms. I think that should influence how we think about our food and also how we choose to live our lives. And that's really kind of one of the main points that Wirzba's making here in the chapter. Along with that, he develops a specifically Christian idea, focusing on the idea that God is a Trinity, right? That God is made up of three persons who are in an intimate relationship with one another. And so you have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And theologians have talked for centuries about how the different persons relate, and obviously it's something that can't be fully understood. But one of the interesting terms that has become part of the tradition for talking about this is this funny term that Wirzba brings up called perichoresis. Perichoresis is a Greek term which basically means circle intercession. It's basically kind of a continuous cycle between persons. Basically that the Father, Son, and Spirit are constantly relating to one another, and there's this cycle of relationships that is set up between the three persons, where they are all intimately connected to one another, intimately involved in each of the other persons, so that there's really, while they are still distinct persons, there's no separation between them. And this is a kind of fundamentally Christian idea of God, And as Christians, or if we're going to kind of try to model the Christian worldview, which includes the idea that human beings are made in the image of God, that's going to mean that human beings should have similar kinds of relationships at least as much as we're able to, so that we as human beings are called to develop these intense personal relationships with others, relationships that are sacrificial, where we give ourselves to other people, we give ourselves to other creatures, and in that way become more and more like God. There's this famous icon of the Trinity that I have here on the bottom of the page, which I think is a very nice icon. It's famous, obviously, because it's beautiful, but it's also, I think, very interesting in that it shows the Trinity sitting at a table. And if you think about this in terms, I can't give you the full picture here because of shapes, constraints, but when you look at the whole picture, it's basically the three persons of the Trinity sitting at a table. And there's an open side of the table, which is inviting the viewer to come in and be part of this setting. And that's, I think, what Wirzba is getting at here in this chapter as well, that there is this perichoresis in the divine life, and we as human beings are called to enter into that, and to mimic that in our own lives. And he's going to talk about, on the next page, we'll look at one of the examples he gives about different ways of approaching bread. And he's going to talk about these different aspects. We'll look at it in a minute. But the ultimate conclusion is that there are basically good and bad ways to eat, right? And what he's going to advocate as good eating is eating that is spiritual. And this doesn't mean, that we're humming or lighting candles while we eat or something like that. It's more, we eat in such a way that we reflect on how the food came to us, how we depend on it, and how we ought to live in response. So I think it's a pretty compelling point if you accept the Christian worldview in general. And to see a little more how he develops that, we'll turn now to his example of bread on the next page. So when Wirzba is trying to give some kind of concrete sense of what it is he's talking about with this communion and relationships and dependence and all that, I think he does a nice job of incorporating a concrete example to kind of flesh those ideas out a little bit. And he has this example where he looks at bread in this small Italian community. And he gives a story of the two different ways bread is produced and consumed in this community, kind of in traditional agriculture, and then with after the advent of modern commercial agriculture following the Green Revolution that we talked about last time. And in the traditional food culture of the village, the production of bread was a very elaborate communal activity. Now, obviously, he picks this example because they had a particularly kind of vibrant culture built around their making of the bread. But I think it's fairly safe to say that many different communities had activities like this where the people would come together to produce their food before the advent of commercial agriculture. And he gives this very nice story about, they would grow the grain for the bread there in the local community, and when you're caring for the fields there right around your homes, the fields that your children are going to use, and their children, then you're going to be very careful about the way you treat the land. You're going to take care of the land. You're not going to kind of strip it of its nutrients or allow erosion to destroy it. You're going to be very careful about preserving this land because it's your land, and the land that your community and family is going to depend on. He also talks about how the work of producing the grain, and then especially getting together to produce the flour and produce the bread, was communal activity, that people were working together to make this bread, and that, of course, in the process, they're talking, they're telling stories, they're forming relationships with one another, and that this kind of knits together the community in an important way. And all of this meant that this bread had real meaning for people, right? That when you saw a loaf of bread, it was connected in your mind with the work that you had done in the field, or that your family member had done in the field, and with the work done by yourself or other family members in the mill or in the bakery. And so this bread was bread that had connections in your mind with all these other creatures, all these other relationships that were part of your life. And that ultimately, Wirzba argues that this is conducive to spiritual eating, right? So that when you're eating, you're not just eating, right? That eating had this larger significance, that it was a chance to reflect on life, to reflect on these relationships. Now, of course, it would be silly to claim that everyone who ate bread in this village was always sitting around reflecting on these deep spiritual themes as they ate dinner. Obviously, that didn't happen, and it doesn't happen in any sort of real life situation. But I think at the same time that there is more meaning to eating in this sort of context, and that while it might not happen all the time, it would be something that you would reflect on, at least at points in your eating. Now, he compares and contrasts that picture with the picture of bread in the community after the advent of commercial food systems and the production of kind of mass-produced bread that we all go and buy in the grocery store. And what does this mean? Well, this means that the grain is produced far away. There's no connection with the particular land. And so when the people are buying their bread, in general, they don't really care about how the fields are cared for. All they care about is that there's bread there, that it's tasty, and that it's cheap. And so there's not that concern with the fields that you have when you know you're going to depend on those fields for generations. There's also a loss of the relationships that came about from the production of the bread, right? You're not working together in the fields. You're not working together in the mill or in the bakery. Now, obviously, you're going to interact somewhat, and perhaps going to the store and talking to the teller, but it's a much different type of relationship and much less time-intensive, and probably, as a result, much less meaningful of a relationship there. Bread also loses that kind of symbolic significance, right? That this is no longer represents the work of my friends and families in the field and the mill. It's just a loaf of bread at the store, right? It doesn't have this kind of broader, iconic, symbolic significance to it, and as a result, we're going to be less likely to eat it spiritually, right? It's hard enough to reflect on the significance of food when we know the people who produced it, when we know where it came from. It's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to reflect on the significance of mass-produced white bread that we buy at the store, because we have no connection with its production, no connection with those who made it. In fact, probably it was at a big factory where there wasn't any particular person who really kind of makes this bread, if you will. Now, again, this is not kind of the definitive argument against modern agriculture, but Wirzba is arguing a very specific point in saying when we reflect on eating, at least traditionally, it has had all of this spiritual significance. He's going to argue that that spiritual significance fits with the key ideas of Christianity, and that then certain ways of eating, certain ways of producing food fit with these Christian spiritual themes better than other ways of eating, other ways of producing food. So that's the argument he's kind of laying out here, and of course ultimately arguing that we should seek to eat spiritually, right? Which is going to mean we're really going to reflect on our food, where it came from, how it's produced. That's going to mean we're going to need to eat food where we know those sorts of things, where we do have more of a connection with it than is really possible in mass-produced kind of corporate agriculture. So anyway, that is kind of his big argument there, looking at the two different types of bread. I wanted to shift gears now a little bit, and we'll leave the Wirzba reading for now, and look at briefly some of the issues related to pollution in the environment and the connection with modern agriculture. And this is something that came up a little bit in the Konkin reading, and it also comes up a bit in this Wirzba chapter and will come up more in others. And this is obviously a big, important topic. There are a whole list of concerns that people have about modern agriculture, and pollution and the impact on the environment is really one of the primary concerns that people have. Now, unfortunately, pairing it with the intro to the Wirzba book means we're not going to really be able to spend a lot of time focusing on this. But if it is something you're interested in, it can certainly be a focus, for example, in your individual papers, if you want to look at that. And obviously it does, I think, connect with what we've been talking about with Wirzba. In particular, this idea that when there's a disconnect between people and the land, that there can be a loss of concern or a loss of attention to the way the land is being treated. Now, obviously, as Konkin talks about in the book that we read, most farms in America are still family farms. They're still owned and operated by individual families. But one of the things he noted in there is that these family farms aren't really family farms like we would imagine in our head, like some sort of Norman Rockwell painting where you have kind of the red barn and the cow and maybe the little tractor and some chickens running around. Now, these family farms, at least the ones that produce the vast majority of our food, are really huge in the scale of hundreds, if not thousands, of acres being farmed by these individual families. And certainly I don't think anyone would deny that, at least in most cases, those families are concerned about their land. They do want to take care of it, and many of them do, in fact, live there on their farms or nearby. But there is, again, an issue of scale. And this kind of goes back to that Catholic social teaching principle of subsidiarity, that we should prefer the small and local as much as possible because that allows us to treat people as people and not so much as statistics or numbers. And the same thing seems to be true in relationship to land, that no matter how well-intentioned someone might be, it's just not possible to focus as carefully on a few thousand acres as it is on 20 acres or 50 acres. That you just can't have the same kind of focus and attention to detail with that land when you're operating on that kind of scale. And so, even though the owners in many cases might be present there, there are simply problems in terms of scale in caring for the land in modern farming. And there, of course, is also, and I think at least an equal factor, if not a bigger one, is something that you can also see very clearly in the Konkin book, that even for those families committed to farming, the economic pressures are intense, and it's only by kind of a constant struggle to keep on top of things, to every program, every new technology, that people are able to remain competitive. And part of that is going to mean that you're going to need to use every, or at least in most cases, every kind of chemical advantage that you can get as well in terms of fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides and all of these things. And again, while you might want to have concern for the environment, the realities of the economic pressures involved are going to mean that you have to do whatever is going to maximize your profit if you're going to want to stay in business. And so all of these different factors kind of combine to produce some significant issues when it comes to modern agriculture and its effect on the environment. And all we really have time to do here is to kind of run through a laundry list of some of the biggest issues. One of the real topics of concern for many people in America today, and for us here in Kansas, where this is becoming a real issue, particularly in western Kansas, is the depletion of aquifers and the lowering of water tables. And part of how that big green revolution took place that we read about in the last book was through irrigation. He doesn't talk about that a lot in the book, but he does talk about how electrification changes things, And part of how that happens is through the advent of a broad-scale irrigation. When you get the machinery and the electricity to make all of that possible. And part of what happens is when you are irrigating hundreds and thousands of acres is that takes an awful lot of water. And what happens is in a matter of years and decades, you use up water that has accumulated over the course of decades and centuries. And so a lot of places, particularly in the American West, are experiencing real crises with the water tables dropping. And what happens, of course, eventually as the water kind of goes down, down, down in these aquifers is that it goes below where the wells are. And people are left without water and are forced to dig deeper wells, which is very expensive. It causes all kinds of problems. Along with that is the problem of the salination of the lands. When you pump this water out of the ground, a lot of times it has all kinds of minerals in it, salt and other kinds of mineral deposits. And so when you pump that out over your field in western Kansas or out in Colorado or Arizona, as we all learned in high school science, when the water evaporates off, what does it leave? It leaves behind this accumulated particles, this sediment, in many cases salt. And over time, of course, as this happens more and more, you end up with this accumulation of salt and other minerals in the soil, which eventually makes the soil unable to really support any kind of life, any kind of plant life. You can see a picture of a severe case of that here in the upper left corner. So that's another serious issue facing a lot of irrigated lands in the U.S. Another huge topic is the destruction and loss of topsoil, where with plowing every year with all the different annual crops that are grown, that stirs up the soil a lot, and then the wind and rain come along, and that soil ends up in the rivers and washes downstream and ends up in the oceans. Over time, you lose a lot of topsoil, and there are whole books, TV series, and all things focusing on this problem. And in many cases in the U.S., centuries and centuries, if not millennia, of topsoil accumulation have been lost in the past 100 or so years, and there's very little that remains. Now, as Konkin argued in his book, this is something that's gotten better, and perhaps it has, but it still certainly is a real concern. Pollution in particular in the water, is another large issue and one that we'll look at more in a moment. But when all of these fields are sprayed with the fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides that we read about in Konkin's book, much of that goes to the plants, remains in the plants, but a fair amount of it also is inevitably going to be washed down into the soil and down into the groundwater and out into the rivers and lakes and ultimately into the oceans. And along with that, you have manure from the huge livestock livestock where there are tens and hundreds of thousands of chickens produced on a single farm, huge feedlots with thousands of head of cattle. All those animals produce a whole lot of manure. And a lot of times it will accumulate in huge piles or huge lagoons, in which cases sometimes there can be disastrous spills. If you want a really kind of grim reading and viewing experience, you can do some Google searching on what happens when hog lagoons spill or are flooded. It's not a very pretty picture. But even when manure is used responsibly and they gather the manure from these big operations and spread it on agricultural fields, again, when the rain comes, a fair bit of that is going to wash off the field and into the water supply and down into the rivers. And all of that ultimately produces algae blooms and dead zones in the waters, which we'll talk about a little more on the next page. And then finally, there's a contribution to greenhouse gases in global warming. And many people argue that agriculture is one of the biggest perpetrators of this, if not the biggest. In addition to all of the farm machinery that's used in modern agriculture, you have all of those thousands and thousands, even millions of animals chewing away and producing all kinds of methane. So there's a whole laundry list of environmental concerns around modern industrial agriculture. Now again, it's not as if there was no environmental impact in traditional agriculture. However, there is an issue of scale here, right? We are producing, as Conkin explained, far more food than we ever had in the past. And even if you're being very efficient, that's going to mean the side effects of that food production are going to increase as well. So these are some real problems. And again, we can't look at all of them. So what I want to do on the next page is just draw our attention specifically to this issue of water pollution and the runoff from fields and livestock operations. All right, so what I want to do for our reading, in addition to the Wirzba chapter, is have you take a look at a short website by a farmers group, and then also just part of a document put out by an environmental group. And basically what I want to do is to introduce you to an ongoing argument about pollution, and in particular water pollution, in modern agriculture. And basically what they are arguing about is this kind of runoff water pollution that has a real impact on the environment. And all of these fertilizers and manure and other things work their way into the water supply. They accumulate in rivers and ultimately accumulate in the ocean. And basically what that does, I give you a nice little graphic here on the page. If you want to blow that up a little, you can see this. But basically what happens is all these nutrients end up in the water. So you get these unnaturally high concentrations of nutrients, which leads to these big algae blooms. So all of this algae, those little microscopic plants in the water, feed on these nutrients, and there's a huge bloom of algae. Well, what happens, of course, when the food runs out is the natural environment there isn't able to support this huge amount of algae, and so they die. And then when they die, they sink to the bottom. And then when they get on the bottom, what happens is they start to break down, that whole circle of life thing. Unfortunately, the problem is that when organisms are decomposing, they suck up oxygen in the process. And so that basically what happens is when you end up with these huge algae blooms decomposing on the bottom of the ocean, it sucks up all the oxygen down there, which means that all of the normal aquatic life down there is basically suffocated and ends up dying. And so you end up with these dead zones in the ocean. Now, there are other issues to do with water pollution that are brought up in the report as well, that all of these different chemicals in the water have a real impact on human health, and so that there's a real concern about potential for disease and weird tasting water and all kinds of other problems. And so basically the environmentalists are arguing that industrial agriculture is the main source of the problem when it comes to water pollution. And as a result, we need some significant changes in the way agriculture works, and in particular they're arguing for policy changes, that the government would impose regulations and would give incentives to farmers who changed the way they did things to minimize this problem. On the other hand, the farmers argue that, much like what you saw in Conkin's book, that they are doing always better in terms of minimizing their chemical usage, that they're producing huge amounts of food, and basically that they're good, hardworking people who don't want to pollute the environment, and they're already doing the best they can. And so the question then I would propose to you is, after you take a look at these two sides and drawing on your introduction to Christian ethics and Wirzba, and your reading from Conkin as well, think about, okay, what would a Christian view of this situation be? Who's right? Do we need to change regulations? Do we need to require farmers to use fewer chemicals or different approaches to producing their crops or not. Right now, of course, the problem with requiring significant changes in agriculture is that it's going to be expensive. It's going to be expensive for the farmers, and as a result, they are going to have to pass those expenses on to consumers, which would mean we have to pay more, or what it would probably mean in reality if the U.S. passed a lot of these regulations, it would mean that farmers in other countries that didn't have those regulations would have a competitive advantage, and so the U.S. farmers would end up going out of business, while the foreign farmers who were including without the regulations would be able to provide products cheaper. In that case, then, we wouldn't really be helping the overall environment. We would just be shifting where the damage was being done. So, what's the proper response, right? Should we be willing to pay more, which is going to mean that we have less money for other things in life, that maybe we need to eat less food, or do we not need to change anything because they're already doing as good as they can, and we can trust the farmers to do well enough, or does there need to be really a big government change along with increased consumer spending? So what I want you to do is to think about this problem and think about what is the right response based on the ethical system and the worldview that we've been building up in this course so far. So that's our introduction to this debate about water pollution and to the Wirzba reading. So I will look to see your questions and your comments on all of this on Blackboard.